If you belong to the millions of Christians who believe that the world operates by spiritual laws, you must listen to these 3 biblical truths. I'm Dr. Mikael Stenhammar. I'm a Pentecostal charismatic pastor and theologian. I grew up in the faith and prosperity gospel. I was myself even a preacher, but I realized that there were some biblical problems here. There were some issues that makes the movement sick, but it's a sickness that needs to be healed. That's why I started Liberating Faith, because I want to disentangle faith from some of these misunderstandings. But what are spiritual laws? Well, it's a teaching very common within the Pentecostal charismatic groups. It's found within the faith and prosperity gospel, within the word of faith movement. And the idea is basically this, that God created the natural world to operate by certain laws. Take the law of gravity that makes a ripe mango, which is my favorite fruit, to fall down when it's ripe and not just float away in the sky. And for that, we're thankful, of course. But the logic is that God created the spiritual world in a similar way, and that the spiritual world also have a set of laws that govern the spiritual operations. So for us as Christians, we need to learn these laws so that we can make our life successful. 2 common laws, of course, is the law of sowing and reaping, that whatever you sow, you will reap. Or another law would be the law of the spoken word, that whatever you confess, you will possess, in a sense, that you create your future by your words. Those belong within the faith and charismatic movement. What does the Bible say? I will show you 3 truths that you must know. The first thing you need to know is that spiritual laws are not in the Bible. Boom. There you have it. I'm sorry if this shakes your world. It shook mine. When I had this insight, whoa, I tell you, my whole theological world shook to its core, because I grew up in the charismatic movement where spiritual laws was just taught and taken for granted. My whole worldview was shaped by the belief that there were spiritual laws. And when I started to realize that, hey, wait a minute, there are no spiritual laws in the Bible, it just shook me to the foundation of my being. And I'm so grateful it did, because any false teaching will put you in bondage. The spiritual laws doctrine is not scriptural, is not in the Bible. I don't mean that images and metaphors of sowing and reaping are unbiblical, because they're of course not. Paul uses them in Galatians chapter 6 or 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Jesus uses them in his parable. But that is not the same as saying that there are spiritual laws, that the world operates by an act-consequence logic. The idea is that if you do A, God will do B, and that outcome is guaranteed. That's not a biblical understanding of the world. That's not within the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's not the story of the Bible. So where does it come from? If it's not in the Bible, where does this idea of spiritual laws come from? Because it's so commonly taught and believed. Well, it comes from outside the Bible. You can call it an enlightenment world idea. That the idea is that the world is governed almost like a machine, and there are certain principles or laws that govern the world. And the human beings are just to learn how that works so we can govern the world. Well, it also comes close to like New Age thinking or New Thought philosophy, which is a non-Christian way of looking at the world. So the idea of spiritual laws is not in the Bible. It is an import from outside the Bible. You should actually be very, very careful. The second thing you need to know about spiritual laws is that belief distorts your vision of God. In the Bible, you'll find that there were people who held to an act-consequence belief. You'll find this especially when you look in the book of Job and 2 of his comforters. If you look at Zophar, who came and comforted Job in chapter 11, you'll find that his understanding of the world is very much a spiritual law view of the world. But what's very interesting is that God was not pleased. So from that, we can learn that to believe that the world has an act-consequence cause and effect law that governs life, we know that that's not what pleases God. It actually dishonors God. So why do spiritual laws dishonor God? Well, because it questions God's love. God's love and grace are freely given. Grace is the outflowing, generous freedom of God. God is the one who loves and gives freely. But if we believe that the world operates by spiritual laws, God is no longer the God of grace who gives freely, because God demands something to happen first. For example, I heard a very known, very famous faith and prosperity word of faith teacher say this. They were saying this about a person who was struggling with their finances. And they said this: God wanted to bless him, but God couldn't because they had not sown anything. Notice what happens here is that God's love and God's grace is limited. God could not let his love and grace overflow into this person's life because of a so-called spiritual law of sowing and reaping that even hindered God to bless this person. Can you see how this teaching actually limits God? It limits God's love and it limits God's freedom. And one thing we need to know about God is that God is absolutely free. With God, nothing is impossible because God is truly free. One theologian said it very well. He said, God is the one who loves in freedom. That's a wonderful way of understanding who God is. When you look at the description of God throughout the Bible, especially when you look at how Jesus speaks about the Holy Spirit in John chapter 3, verse 8, he speaks about the Holy Spirit as free, as the wind that blows wherever the wind wishes. Well, it is the Spirit he speaks about, and the Spirit is sovereign. We can never control God. We can never put the Holy Spirit in a box. But the law of sowing and reaping, the idea of spiritual laws, they limit God, they distort God, and they put God in a box. The third thing you need to know about spiritual laws is that they are not helpful for spiritual health and for mental health. Why? Because if you live in a world where you believe that there are spiritual laws that govern your life, when you get into trouble, you will end up in a very destructive cycle of self-blame and guilt. When I lived in this worldview shaped by spiritual laws, I happened to get a digestion disorder. I spent a lot of time fasting and praying, and instead of eating sometimes, I also just drank coffee to stay awake. And somehow that brought me into some big problems. I had to eat tablets, 8 tablets a day just to function normally. What happened then is that because of spiritual laws, I start to turn myself inside out to find, where did I miss it? How did I cancel one of the laws of life and health that should have worked health in my life? And I just blame myself. And it's very destructive. And I've seen how many believers fall into this guilt and self-blame because they believe that they have broken a spiritual law. And they turn themselves inside out to find out where they broke it and which law that they have broken. It is not helpful. That's not how the relationship with God works. The idea of spiritual laws also feed into our pride. How? Well, because if you get something, maybe you get some financial increase in your life, or you enjoy a certain amount of health, you can actually say, well, I have sown for this. I have worked this spiritual law. So in a sense, what happens is that the blessings we have in life, they become merited. Somehow I earned them by working a certain law. And even though nobody will say it, it will actually turn around to feed into our pride. So if the idea of spiritual laws is not in the Bible, if it distorts our vision of God, and if it's not good for our spiritual and mental health, why do so many people believe it? For that and other interesting questions, check out my Q&A sessions here on YouTube. If this video has been a help to you, I would ask you to consider subscribing to my channel, and also just give a thumb up and put some comments here. I would love to interact with you. God bless you.